Okay, I think we're live. I'm joined by Father Dwight Longenecker, who probably does not need any introduction by anybody who's watching this. He is a rather famous blogger on Patheos, and he's the author of many books. And he is also one of the handful of married Catholic priests in the world. He was an Anglican pastor in England for many years, and then he and his family converted to Roman Catholicism, and he had a call to come and be a pastor in his native South Carolina. And so under special provisions for former Anglican clergy, he is one of the very few married Catholic priests. So thank you, Father Dwight, for joining me, and it's very nice to meet you.
Great, nice to meet you too at last. We've had some email correspondence.
Yes, we've been going back and forth. We've both written books, and we've both read each other's books. And so today we're going to talk about your new book, which is absolutely fascinating, The Mystery of the Magi. I have many questions about it. I just finished reading it for the second time, and
Wow.
I was absolutely fascinated by it. And you made a convert out of me.
Good.
But I have a few questions, so I'd like to get that.
Sure.
But tell us a little bit about your story. I mean, how did your whole journey? I know you were raised in a conservative Protestant family, and you went to Bob Jones University, and then you eventually went to Oxford. So could you tell us all about that?
I'll have to give you the short version.
Sure.
It was while I was at Bob Jones that I became an Anglican in a little Anglican breakaway schismatic church, and from there I was reading a lot of C.S. Lewis and T.S. Eliot and all the Anglican English greats, and got this crazy idea in my head that I wanted to be an Anglican country parson, a little bit like the poet George Herbert, and hunker down in a little English village somewhere. And well, it happened. I was able to go to Oxford and study theology, and then be ordained as an Anglican priest, and ended up in a beautiful old village on the Isle of Wight.
Really?
As an Anglican priest.
That's an amazing story. Did you meet your wife in England, or how did that work?
Yeah, I met her when I was an assistant priest in the parish, and she was a member of the parish, and that all came together. It was like something out of one of those Jane Austen novels, like who's going to marry the young vicar sort of thing. And but yeah, it was fantastic. But by the early 1990s, the Church of England was going in a very different trajectory away from the historic faith, and that brought me more and more to look at the claims of Catholicism, and that then led to the Catholic faith, and eventually 10 years later to come back to the U.S. to be a Catholic priest.
So you had a kind of a crisis. I mean, this if you've I mean, that's a very courageous thing to do. Your livelihood was as a priest, and to convert to Roman Catholicism for whatever reason, I mean, that's an unusual thing to do, I would think.
Yeah, it was a little bit of the old wave walking on that one, because I hadn't trained for any other career. By this time, I had a wife and 2 children. We just stepped out of the boat and trusted the Lord. And it was I always say, if your Christian faith is not an adventure, then it's not faith. It's something else. And that was a real testing time, but an adventuresome time too.
So give me the chronology. When was this exactly? What year? And so you had 2 children. What year did you finally?
In 1995, and then I worked for a little Catholic charity in England for another 10 years. And then in 2005, we got the call to come back to the U.S.
And that was through, how did that work? When you say you got a call, how does does the Vatican say, "Oh, gee, we have this Anglican priest, we could
no,
recruit him,"
or what? It was it was complicated. My application for the priesthood in England was being delayed for all sorts of complicated reasons. And then when I was visiting back in my hometown in Greenville, South Carolina, the local parish priest said, "Well, you could consider the Bishop of Charleston to be your bishop as well. Although you're living in England, you're an American citizen, and this is your hometown." So I had a word with the Bishop of Charleston, and he said, "Well, you went to Bob Jones University. Why don't you come and be a priest here? You understand these people, And so it all opened up then for an appropriate job opened up then for me to return to the U.S.
Oh, okay. Well, that's just amazing. So now you are the pastor of what parish? Or
Our Lady of the Rosary is a small parish in the south side of Greenville. It's in a socially, economically challenged area. We have lots of unfortunate stuff going on right there, but it's a lively parish. We just built a beautiful new church. We have a school that's being renovated, and so there's lots of good stuff happening.
So how do you fit in there? I'm just curious. I mean, you're a went to Bob Jones University. You do know the people. I mean, you're considered an odd duck, or do people know you, or how is the cultural adjustment? I mean, from
yeah, well, I think when I was at Bob Jones in the 1970s, I think it's fair to say there was a lot of virulent anti-Catholicism there. The old stuff about the Catholic Church is the great whore of Babylon and all that stuff, and
Jack Chick.
a lot of that, a lot of that has softened now. The rhetoric is softened. There's still an awful lot of gut level instinct against Catholicism within American evangelicalism, but they make friendly words. And that's a good thing. That's progress. So
Yes.
That's pretty much the relationship with Bob Jones. I go over there from time to time for arts events, and we have mutual friends, and there's a steady stream of converts from Southern Baptist and Bob Jones, and most of them end up knocking on my door.
Yes, I went to a liberal evangelical seminary, Fuller. It's considered very progressive, but there was a kind of a underlying anti-Catholic bias. But people were very, very nice. And during the height of the sexual abuse crisis, people no longer came up to me to debate justification by faith alone. They just put their hand on my shoulder and said, sorry.
Yeah.
They felt sorry for me more than anything.
Yeah, and there is a friendliness towards Catholicism amongst a lot of Protestants, but we have to understand too that being anti-Catholic is in their bloodstream. That's how they were formed 500 years ago, with a deep, they were a reaction against against Catholicism. It's in their bloodstream, and should they really allow that to be eroded, I find that very often they become Catholics.
Yeah.
G.K. Chesterton said that once a man starts to be fair to the Catholic Church, it's not long before he's attracted to it, and I think that's very interesting.
Okay, so tell me about your time at Oxford. What did you study exactly, like general theology, or what was your degree in?
Yeah, I was a student at Wycliffe Hall, which is an evangelical seminary, theological college at Oxford. And so while I was there, I was preparing for the Anglican priesthood, and but tapped into all the great theological resources there. We had access to the libraries, to the lectures by the theologians at the mainstream colleges, as well as all of the other denominational colleges. I mean, every religious group, Christian religious group, has a seminary in Oxford. So we would go to lectures at Blackfriars and St. Benet's Hall, the Catholic places, as well as the Reformed seminaries and the Anglican ones. It was all very, very stimulating.
Yeah, it was a very ecumenical kind of context and all that. So,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you studied all the modern critical approaches to the New Testament and so on. You were probably steeped in that, even though you were at an evangelical college.
Yes.
So what led you to the crazy idea that the Magi are actually historical?
Well, at Bob Jones, I became critical of extreme fundamentalism, which very often was unfortunately unthinking and deeply biased against, of course, all of the modern critical methods. But it was at Oxford that I actually became very critical of the modern criticism. So I was kind of critical of the critics on both sides, because
Skeptical
I found
of the skeptics, I like to say.
Yeah, skeptical of the skeptics, and I felt that the modernists at Oxford were just as blinkered in many ways as the fundamentalists were. I can remember, for instance, in a New Testament seminar, when some of us students just in a very intelligent way began to challenge the professors, the usual line that the Gospels were written many decades after the events, that the stories had changed and evolved and been exaggerated and blown out of proportion, that the miraculous elements were all added later as mythological invention, that the Gospels weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but those names were pasted on by somebody later, the whole thing.
Yes.
And when some of the students began to challenge that with facts and in a very respectful but smart way, the professor just shut down that that conversation. He shut it down with ridicule and sarcasm, in the same way that a Bob Jones New Testament professor would have shut down the conversation if you went in and questioned something like, young Earth creationism or something like
Yes,
that,
yes.
which was one of their assumptions.
But isn't it amazing that recently like, some of the top scholars, I mean, some of the biggest names in New Testament scholarship are now actually going to that view, are also questioning the questioners, or being skeptical of skeptics. I mean, some of the biggest names around in New Testament scholarship are on that side. James Dunn and N.T. Wright and all these people are blazing just that path. So in a sense,
they are, and there's some remarkable bits of scholarship coming out. The name of the guy in St. Andrews has escaped me at the moment. Begins with a B, Balkwell, something like that. Who's written?
Balcam.
Yeah, about the eyewitness accounts.
Yeah, Richard Balcam. Although I think he's retired now, but yes.
I mean, his work is just line by line, so detailed and well argued that you can't get around someone like me already knew and felt, that the Gospels are based on eyewitness accounts. Indeed, what Luke himself says, that he bases it on eyewitness. What we have seen and what we have heard, he says.
Yes.
Other Margaret Barker, the English scholar, who also really liked my book, she said,
you quote her a bit.
Yeah, and I got in correspondence with her, and she said, in the last 50 or 60 years, the discoveries that have been made in archaeology and forensics and textual criticism, and in the scientific and historical research, which has been brought out by so many scholars, and many of them liberal scholars like Geza Vermesh, who has done so much work on early Jewish roots of Christianity, and the work that you've discovered in your book and you've chronicled there of the archaeological discoveries, they're all very exciting. And in other words, the short version is, we know a lot more about it than they did in the middle of the 20th century.
Yes, I mean, I remember I spoke with Larry Hurtado, who's an American actually at the University of Edinburgh, and I asked him, there seems to be so many people in universities who don't know about his work, about how early there was worship of Jesus in the Christian community. I mean, it was astonishingly early, and it's exactly the opposite of what the early critics of the late 19th century and early 20th century said. And he said, well, yeah, a lot of people don't keep up.
Yeah, and in fact, they're using the assumptions that are now not just 50 years old, but it's almost 100 years old. And those assumptions, when you look at Bultmann and the demythologizers, they were working with the facts which they had then. Not only do we know more about the New Testament times, as I've just said, but we also know an awful lot more about literary criticism and anthropology. Questions about, how does myth actually develop within a society? How does legend develop within a society? How do these literary forms actually, how are they promulgated? How did they develop in the ancient world? We know more about that too, and all of that evidence also gives the lie to the old New Testament scholarship idea that these stories were elaborated. We know, for instance, an awful lot more about the Jewish tradition of passing on the stories orally to their disciples, and how the disciples actually took notes in those days, and how they actually memorized word for word what their masters and their teachers had said. So again, all this kind of literary scholarship, archaeology, is all coming together in a fantastic way.
Yes, I love that. I'm one of the few that really argue for the notes idea, that that the Jewish people weren't as illiterate as people seem to think. We have recent discoveries of pottery shards in which common soldiers were able to scribble notes. So the whole idea that there was a completely illiterate culture, and that everything was done orally and there weren't any notes taken, I find that a bit hard to swallow personally.
Indeed, but also not only was it literate, but the oral tradition, which we kind of dismiss as being just so much rumor and gossip, was actually very structured. Even today, I believe Orthodox Jewish boys need to memorize great, huge tracts of the Old Testament in the Hebrew, and they're corrected line by line and word by word so they get it right. So there was this great tradition of part of the oral tradition was not just passing on hearsay, but actually passing on faithfully an oral tradition because it
Yes.
was considered that important.
I once interviewed a Tibetan Lama. I'm strange that way, and he said what the first thing you do is you memorize the text, the entire text, and then you start the commentaries on it. But before you memorize the text, you can't even discuss it. So anyway, well, let's talk about your book. So what got you interested in the Magi, the Magoi? That's such an unusual topic, and as you said, you're cast out of the biblical guild if you even bring it up. So it's a strange topic. I mean, I've always accepted, Father Raymond Brown. I was raised on Father Brown and his kind of dismissal that any attempt to find historicity in the Magi is doomed to fail, and yet you took on this very fascinating topic.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I got started because I was asked to write an article for one of the magazines on where did the Magi come from, and so I knew about the theory that they came from Persia, but I thought, what if that's not true? And so I began actually by looking at the prophecies in Isaiah 60, where it says that the kings shall come bearing gifts of gold and frankincense from Midian, Sheba, and Ephah. And I said, where is Midian, Sheba,
Yes,
and Ephah?
where is Midian?
Where is this? It was in these are the names of some of the northwestern tribes in northwestern Arabia, and Arabia is littered with all of these nomadic tribes. So I began to research them and say, well, who was there in Jesus' time? And then it came up with the Nabateans. And so one thing led to another, and I really didn't have this all worked out before I wrote the book. I genuinely did the research, and as I did, the pieces of the puzzle just fell into place amazingly. And I was worried all along the line that I might be accused of forcing the pieces of the puzzle to fit together.
Yes.
And honestly, I didn't. This might be unknown to me, and I haven't seen my own fault. And if any scholars want to correct me, I'm not a great scholar. They can do so. But there it is.
Yeah, but it was fascinating. You built that case very systematically about how, and the Nabateans were known for precisely gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and that was, they were known as merchants of these things, and then you also very skillfully deconstructed the notion that the Magi from Persia, they had long since been dissipated and oppressed and so on. And so if the Magi came from anywhere, the place they would likely come from would be Nabatea. And I was also fascinated how in Isaiah, the weakest point for me of your book, but also the most fascinating one, was that how maybe second Isaiah was penned in Nabatea, and the reference to Selah, which is rock, the ordinary Hebrew word for rock, refers to Petra, which is the name of the Nabatean capital. Could you talk about that a little bit more? I mean, that was just absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, that was also very intriguing to me. And that hint came up in one scholar about the second Isaiah. First of all, I think it's generally concluded by most scholars that the second half of Isaiah does date from after the exile in 586 BC when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. I know that's not a universally held opinion, but I think it is a majority opinion. And therefore, one scholar said that the prophecies in the second half of Isaiah may very well originate not in Babylon amongst the exiles, but amongst one of the many Jewish exile communities in Arabia. And Tema is one of the main sort of candidates for that. Tema was a very important oasis town in northwest Arabia, and right on the trade route of the Nabateans, and also with links back to the Babylonian culture. So in the 6th century BC, the area was settled by three factors: the the Arabian nomadic tribes, all who had an Abrahamic descent or claimed Abrahamic descent, the Jewish refugees from the destruction of Jerusalem who were settling in the area, and the Neo-Babylonians who controlled that territory. And all these three cultural factors came together. And the theory is that Isaiah, the prophecies of second Isaiah themselves, are rooted in northwestern Arabia.
Yeah, and the really intriguing thing was when you point out that King Herod the Great was the child of a Nabatean princess and was raised in Petra or in Nabatea, and therefore the envoys that would come from the Nabatean king, that just made complete sense that they had connections with him.
Yeah, not only that, but soon after, just a few years after Herod the Great's death, his son Herod Antipas also marries the daughter of the Nabatean king. So right at that time period, they were both intent on establishing good diplomatic relations.
Yeah.
And that marriage between Herod's son and the king, the daughter of the King Aretas of the Nabateans, confirms that fact.
Yeah, I love the way you deconstructed. A lot of times people read into the New Testament things that aren't actually there, that they either have heard or through popular culture and so on. And you do a good job of showing, what the text actually says versus what people think it says. And for example, that there weren't three kings riding camels. It was likely three Magi riding horses, and not a long distance, but from Nabatea.
Not even three.
Yeah, not even three. Right, that's right. It doesn't even say three. Yeah. So,
yeah, and I understand also why why most scholars dismiss the Magi story. They're not actually dismissing what Matthew wrote. They're dismissing the popular understanding of the Magi story, which came down to us for really centuries. The elaboration of the story began in the 2nd and 3rd century and continued right through the Middle Ages. So what they're dismissing is the popular idea of these three mystical wizards from the east who followed the magical star across the desert sands. Well, that does sound like a fairy tale, but that's not actually Matthew's account. And it astounds me that New Testament scholars or historical scholars simply swallowed the mythical version and never actually. That's why I feel what I've discovered is totally new, because nobody took the trouble to do what I did, which was to say, look, let's actually dismantle and pull out all those mythical elements from the story.
yes, I mean, so often in terms of apologetics, evangelicals go to great lengths to try and prove the historicity of different things, and for example, the star, and you talk about all the different theories of what the Star of Bethlehem could have been, and modern people find it incredible that a star would move across the sky and then stop over a single house or something, and you show that that's not actually what the text says, and all the different theories of the astrological significance of different things that could have just made people want to explore further. We'll talk about that a little bit more, how you see the Star of Bethlehem.
Yeah, you see, again, people have the idea that a magical star moved across the night sky and guided the shepherd step by step. This actually comes from Gnostic infancy narratives from the 2nd to 4th centuries. Some of them, which I've recounted in the book, were totally fantastic and totally fictional fairy tales about this. It wasn't really a star. It was a burning vision of a baby that spoke to them and did miracles step by step as it led them across the night sky. Well, these versions came into the Middle Ages and came into the Western tradition. And people therefore read Matthew and understood it to be this magical star that moved across the night sky. Matthew never says that's what it was. Instead, we believe that these people were astrologers, and they saw certain configurations of planets and constellations, which they interpreted to mean the newborn king would be born to the Jews. It's really complicated, but a simple version of this would be, let's say that the constellation Aries, the ram, represents Judah, and the planet Jupiter represents royal ascent. So when the planet Jupiter rises in Aries, they interpret that a new king is coming into the house of Judah. the concept is simple. The application is very complicated. And this theory is combined with the idea that a comet, which was actually recorded at the same time period in the annals of Chinese astrologers, might actually also have gone together with this phenomenon to produce the astral effect.
Sure, and as you point out, everyone knew Herod was getting older and he was he was likely going to die soon. So to look for what was going to happen in the near term would be natural, especially for people in a nearby kingdom that would want to know, with all the political intrigue and Rome, and you go into all the detail about the complicated relationship with Rome and all of this. So everybody would have an interest in knowing what's going to happen with Herod's successor, especially given how homicidal he was.
Also, what intrigued me was discovering these political and economic details, because the Nabatean kingdom just to the east of the Judeans, they were both client kingdoms of Rome. In other words, Caesar Augustus was their overlord. And the Nabateans needed to get across Herod's Judean kingdom to the port of Gaza to get their goods to market. And therefore, he controlled his borders. He had very strict borders with them, and very strict sort of, what you call them, customs
Tariffs?
Posts and all the rest of it, where he taxed them as they came through. And so it was crucial for them to have a good relationship with the king of Judea. And as Herod was on his last legs, and because the succession was very shaky, he had these three sons, and who was going to be the next king, Aretas IV would have been very eager to secure that relationship.
Yeah, and the whole massacre of the innocents that the people also dismiss is just completely made up. To me, what we know about Herod, it fits perfectly with his MO. I mean, he killed his one of his beloved wives. I killed I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 of his own sons because he thought they were plotting against him. So it fits his personality to a T. And the fact that we don't have any corroborating historical backup to the story, like in Josephus or something, we don't have a lot of corroborating things from much of ancient history. So
I know, and the dismissal of the slaughter of the innocents is a classic case of liberal scholars arguing from silence.
Yes,
they say because we don't have any corroborating evidence, it must not have happened. But we have to remind them that lack of evidence is not evidence. And therefore, what we do know about, as you say, about Herod and his personality, that he would kill just about anything or anyone who he thought threatened his throne, it fits in perfectly well with what we do know of him and his behaviors.
Yes. Well, what I really loved about your book, again, the mystery of the Magi. Let me see if I can hold it up here so people can see it. It's a wonderful book, The Mystery of the Magi. The subtitle is The Quest to Identify the Three Wise Men. You even say 3 wise men, boy.
Yeah, I had to do that so people would know what the Magi was.
Yes.
People in the popular imagination aren't too sure.
But what's great about it, what I really, really liked about it, is how you skillfully introduce people to the, to how faithful Christians should approach biblical scholarship, and how you should be skeptical of skeptics, but also not fundamentalist, and how you should use all the tools of modern biblical scholarship, which the Catholic Church urges people to do. And so it was just a delightful read. Because of that, because it was like a little mini seminar into how we should read the Bible and study issues in the Bible as faithful Christians, and taking advantage of all the modern developments in archaeology and critical biblical studies and so on. So I thought it was fantastic in that way.
Well, thanks. And I've had some good comments from people who have taken the time to read it. I have to admit that a good number of the scholars have just ignored it because I guess it's a popular kind of written in a popular style, I guess. I don't know. But those who have complimented me like you had and said, look, it's pretty neat that you haven't taken either the fundamentalist or the radical view, but you just actually did something called look for the facts.
Yeah, well, that's amazing when you do that. So tell me about this pilgrimage that you're cooking up. I understand you're thinking of doing a pilgrimage to where all this takes place, which is, of course, the amazing kingdom of Petra, or the city of Petra.
Yeah, we're planning a pilgrimage from September 10th to 18th of this year, and we'll be flying to Jordan and beginning in Petra and retracing the steps of the Magi. According to my view, of course, this isn't a very long journey because it's only about 300 miles between Petra and Jerusalem. So we're not going to be riding camels for a long time from India across the desert sands,
Right.
but still, we'll be able to dig into some of the evidence in the book. We're hoping to visit the ruins of the temple of Khirbet at Tanor, which is where the famous zodiac was found, which proves that the Nabateans were actually astrologers and stargazers. And then we'll be retracing the trade route through Petra up to Bethlehem, and then on for a full pilgrimage of the Holy Land to Jerusalem and the Galilee and so forth.
Oh, now is there a website where people can go to check this out, or how do people find out about it?
Yeah, the tour organizers are still putting together the promotional material for the tour, but they can certainly get in touch by just connecting with my website, dwightlongenecker.com. There will soon be information there about the whole thing.
That sounds exciting. I would love to come on a trip like that.
We're going to see if we can work that out.
Okay. Well, Father, I don't want to take too much of your time because I know you're busy, and I was late getting started because of my computer issues, which happen frequently. But again, I'd like to thank you. It was a fantastic book. What are you going to do next? What's next for an encore?
Well, you know, I'm working on an idea which is called Angels, the Evidence. And if the Magi was a tough one, then I think angels will be more difficult. But I've always felt for some time that, again, we dismiss angels as really being the equivalent of fairies, you know, and do you really believe in fairies? And actually the idea that there are extraterrestrial spiritual intelligences that interact with the human race is, you know, it's part of human culture. Every religion, every culture, every tribe of people has this idea or belief in demigods or angels or intermediary spiritual beings. And so I'm going to be exploring that phenomenon from that beginning point, and then looking at some of the theories of human psychology and theories about the paranormal, which go through to offer increasing evidence, therefore, that if we don't actually believe in angels, we should at least take them more seriously.
I think that's fascinating, actually. I had a friend of mine who graduated from an elite theological school, and I won't name names, but he got his PhD in systematic theology, and he was a big proponent of guardian angels of all things. And this is some guy that you would never expect to believe in guardian angels, yet he did, and he had very strong biblical and philosophical reasons for that. So, well,
there's also a very interesting book out, which is a little bit new agey, but quite fascinating. It's called the Physics of Angels, and a physicist combines with the theologian, and they look at physics, and they look at St. Thomas Aquinas' understanding of angels, where he said that angels were actually beings of light, and he talks about them moving at incredible, unimaginable speed, and therefore, there's Thomas Aquinas, you know, in what was it, the 13th century, using language which the physicists then began to pick up on and say, you know, this is exactly how light works, and so there's all sorts of intriguing sort of connections with that sort of language to talk about what we regard as spiritual beings.
Is that Frank Tipler? He's a physicist who did a book called The Physics of Christianity or something like that.
No, this is, I think, a guy called Rupert Sheldrake.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think
he's at Oxford, isn't he?
I don't remember. It's on my shelves here somewhere.
Yeah. Well, there's all these strange characters at Oxford that are the relationship between science and Christianity that I've always been interested in.
Yeah, I think it might be beyond my capabilities, but I'm going to give it a try.
Good. You take on challenges. I like it. Okay, Father. Well, thank you very much. I will be in touch, and I will do what I can to tell everybody about your book. Once again, it's the Mystery of the Magi, and it's doing very well, I understand, and everybody can get it at Amazon and all the online bookstores, and even the few bookstores that are left.
Yeah, it's also available as an audio book and an ebook and a Kindle book, a Kindle edition. So Hope people pick it up and spread the news. Thanks for your help.
Well, thank you. It's nice talking to you.
Good talking to you too.